In my book, in fact, I do not take a stand on whether or not Jesus is God. That's a theological question, a religious question. And so to pretend that I'm trying to argue that Jesus is not God is completely wrong, and it confuses the categories of history and theology that I'm trying to keep straight.
Welcome to the Humanist Hour, the official broadcast of the American Humanist Association. In this episode, Bible 101, everything about the Bible in 5 minutes that we want you to know. We explore the question, how Jesus became God. Then, we explore the critics who explore the question, how God became Jesus. All coming up on the Humanist Hour. Hello everybody, my name is Bo Bennett, and I am your host for this week's show. Today we're going to be talking with Dr. Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman is one of the most renowned and controversial Bible scholars in the world today. He's a master explainer of Christian history, texts, and traditions. His work continues to drive debate among supporters and detractors alike. Dr. Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he lives in Durham, North Carolina. Dr. Ehrman, how are you?
I'm well, thanks.
Great. Thanks so much for being on our show. I want to start out by asking you, tell us your story in 60 seconds. Who is Bart Ehrman? Go.
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, I am a professional biblical scholar. I teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm an expert on the New Testament and the historical Jesus and early Christianity. I got into the field of biblical studies because I was personally a very religious teenager and became a fundamentalist Christian. And as I did my research over the years and I went on to graduate school and started reading the New Testament in Greek and the Old Testament in Hebrew, I realized that, in fact, my views about the Bible, that it was inerrant without mistake, were completely wrong. And I eventually became a liberal Christian, which I was for many years. But eventually then, because of other issues, I became an agnostic. So I'm an agnostic biblical scholar.
It's an amazing story. I've heard it before. I'm wondering about what percentage of people, of your peers that went through the same schooling, do you think follow that same path?
Very few indeed. There are about, there are thousands of New Testament scholars in the country, and there's probably only a handful of us who are agnostic or atheist.
So it wasn't the learning process that actually did it. It must have been something else that turned you from a conservative to a liberal to eventually an agnostic.
Well, the scholarship did turn me from a conservative to a liberal because I realized that the Bible was, in fact, full of discrepancies and contradictions and mistakes, so that the Bible I came to see was a very human book and not a divine revelation. But the reason I stopped being a Christian altogether was unrelated to that. It was as I struggled with the problem of suffering and how one can explain that there's a good and powerful God in control of this world, given all the misery that people face here. And so about 15 or 16 years ago, I decided I just didn't believe it anymore and became an agnostic.
Yeah, the old burning bunny in the forest fire thing.
Yes, right. Yeah, those poor bunnies.
Right. Well, let's begin, if we can, with a biblical primer. Just for those of our listeners who aren't quite up to speed on the Bible. First question I have for you, again, these are kind of basic, so please don't be insulted, but who wrote the Bible and when was it written?
It depends if you're talking about the New Testament or the Old Testament. The New Testament is my field of specialization, so I'll answer that. If you want to talk about the Hebrew Bible, I can do that as well. The New Testament was written primarily in the first century, the Common Era. And so that means, to get the dates straight, Jesus probably died around the year 30 of the Common Era. And the New Testament was written 20 to 50 years after that. Most of the New Testament is anonymous or pseudonymous, so that we have a number of letters that claim to be written by people who almost certainly did not write them, including, for example, 2 letters allegedly written by Jesus' follower Peter, or 1 letter written by his brother James. So most of the New Testament, we don't know who the authors were. The one big exception is that we have a number of letters written by the Apostle Paul.
Now, would this be just your agnostic bias kicking in, saying that some of these letters weren't definitely written by the people who say they are, or is this pretty much understood in biblical scholarship, including the Christians?
Yeah, it's understood in biblical scholarship, except among fundamentalists and conservative evangelicals who know that everyone else thinks this, but they don't think so themselves. This is the point of view that I learned when I was being trained to be a minister at the Princeton Theological Seminary. So it's a very common view among scholars.
So this is where maybe faith kicks in and takes over, and biblical scholarship kind of takes a backseat.
Well, no, it's just the biblical scholars realize that historically, Paul did not write the book of 1 Timothy. Now, what they do with that theologically is a whole different question. But it doesn't really bother liberal Christian theologians because they understand that, of course, the faith has to be based in historical fact.
Right. Okay. So when did the Bible become the Bible?
So the books of the New Testament were written sometime during the first century of the Common Era. But there were a lot of other books being written at the same time. So there were other Gospels and other letters and other apocalypses, and these were all in circulation over the next several centuries. And different groups of Christians considered different groups of these writings to be authoritative. One of these groups of Christians ended up gaining more converts than any of the others, and by the 4th century, it had declared itself to be orthodox, which means that it held the right beliefs, and everybody else held the wrong beliefs. And this Orthodox group decided on which books would be in the New Testament. The first time anyone listed our 27 books as the 27 books of the New Testament was near the end of the 4th Christian century. So it was about a 400-year process.
Wow. Now, was this orthodoxy, was this done by majority vote, or was it the people in power at the time who got to declare orthodoxy?
Well, there never was a vote about it per se, and it just kind of happened. I mean, it's like a country that has a constitution that's not written. Just everybody kind of understands what the Constitution is, and that's kind of what happened with orthodoxy. One group of Christians emerged as being more powerful because they had far more converts and they ran the churches. And so there didn't have to be a vote because everybody knew who was in power.
I've always found it interesting, Marcion, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, his view that the two gods, there are two different gods. Can you tell us a little bit about that? That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, so Marcion was a Christian teacher, theologian who lived in the 2nd Christian century, and he maintained that the God of the Old Testament could not be the God of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament for Marcion was a God of wrath. He believed in killing all the Canaanites so that the Israelites could take over the Promised Land, and that contrasted with the God that Jesus proclaimed, who was a God of love, who said that you're to love your enemies, not kill them. And so Marcion concluded that they couldn't be the same God, and so he insisted that there were, in fact, literally two separate gods, and that Christians should follow the God of Jesus, and Jews followed the God of the Old Testament. This view ended up, of course, being declared a heresy.
Yeah, because it would take us out of the monotheistic religion.
And it would reject the idea that the creator of this world was the God of Jesus.
Right. So how different, if at all, do you think are the original manuscripts from the modern version of the King James Bible?
Well, that's the problem, is that unless we actually have the originals in hand, we can't say how different they were. There are a number of places where we don't know what the authors originally wrote. There are a lot of places where we know what they wrote, and we have a pretty good idea what they wrote, and it's pretty clear that scribes wanted to change places like that. So we have thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament, and so it's a better attested book than any other book from the ancient world by a large margin. But these manuscripts also have far more different readings in them than for any other book from the ancient world, and that makes it complicated knowing what the authors wrote originally.
But is it fair to say that because we have so many manuscripts that it's more reliable if many of the manuscripts were based on like one common manuscript or even a few?
Yeah, that's the problem. I mean, if you've got 20 manuscripts and they were all copied from the same manuscript, then you don't have 20 witnesses. You have one witness.
Right.
But no, it is. I mean, it. There are authors from the ancient world for whom we have only one manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's a lousy manuscript, then our hands are more or less tied in figuring out what he originally wrote. With the New Testament, we have over 5,600 manuscripts. So we are in better shape with the New Testament than other books. But, for most books, we're not in very good shape.
Right. Yeah, well, that makes sense. All right, let's move on to talk about your book. With your book, How Jesus Became God, The Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. You have come to several conclusions with which biblical scholars, conservative ones, are not too happy. We'll get to some of those in a bit. First, I believe I read in your book that you've come to a different view on Jesus' burial and the empty tomb. Is that correct? And if so, what was the change?
Yes, this is something that evangelical scholars are not happy about.
Of course.
There's a lot of my book they are happy about, but not this one. So in the book, I devote 2 chapters to the question of Jesus' resurrection. As an agnostic, of course, I don't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, but it's a historical fact that some of his disciples, thought he was raised from the dead. Mm-hmm. And so the question I deal with is what made them think that? And what I used to think until doing the research on this book was what everybody says, that there were 2 main things that made the disciples think that Jesus was raised from the dead. The first is that they went to the tomb where he had been buried on the 3rd day, and they found that it was empty. And second, he appeared to them. Mm-hmm. So I started wondering about this business of there being an empty tomb because I knew that ancient practices of crucifixion were key to the problem. And so I started examining what ancient authors say about crucifixion. And the constant refrain among authors who talk about it is that when a person was crucified by the Romans, their bodies were left on the cross as part of the punishment after they died. Mm-hmm. So the punishment wasn't simply the tortuous death of crucifixion. It was also the fact that the person was not allowed a decent burial, which everybody in the ancient world wanted, and the bodies were left to decompose in a public and humiliating way and to be eaten by scavengers. And so if that's the common practice among Romans, the only question is, was an exception made in the case of Jesus? And I argue in the book that probably not. Probably Jesus was not made an exception. And so more likely his body was left to decompose on the cross and that eventually he was tossed into some kind of common grave.
Now, wouldn't Christians argue that it was Joseph of Arimathea who was actually responsible for having Jesus buried and taken down from the cross? And of course, he had the means to do that and probably the political power. When we get back from the break, you could tell us what you think about that. You're listening to the Humanist Hour. I'm Bo Bennett, and we are speaking with Dr. Bart Ehrman on his book, How Jesus Became God, The Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. So doesn't Joseph of Arimathea explain the whole Jesus burial thing?
Right. Well, that's what happens in the Gospels, is that Joseph of Arimathea is a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. Okay. And he asks Pilate for the body, and Pilate gives him the body, and then he puts it in his own tomb. So I explain in the book why that is highly unlikely. We don't know of this figure, Joseph of Arimathea, from any other source. And even in the New Testament, it says that he was a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. Well, the Jewish Sanhedrin is what condemned Jesus to death. And it says they all condemned him to death. And so it's a little bit odd that now, the next day, all of a sudden, this person is on Jesus' side, when earlier he was against him. Right. So I think that probably this is a legend that sprang up fairly early in the Christian tradition to explain, to give evidence that Jesus was raised from the dead because he had an empty tomb.
Now, did this burial story come from multiple sources, or do you think this was one of the lines that were perhaps copied from the same source?
I think they all have to go back to the same source. Somebody made up the story because you get the story both in the Gospel of John and in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so the story started out fairly early and was picked up by different people who were telling the accounts of Jesus' death and resurrection.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, from your point of view, why is this question about how Jesus became God so important to Christians as well as non-Christians?
Well, for Christians, I think it's of utmost importance because there are 2 billion Christians in the world today, and the vast majority of them believe that Jesus is God. But almost every historian, even conservative evangelical Christians, will say that during his lifetime, when Jesus was talking to his disciples, he was not telling them that he was the second member of the Trinity. Well, if he wasn't saying that during his lifetime, how did this view come about? And so even Christians have to be interested in the question of how it is Christians started calling Jesus God, and in fact started calling him equal with God, if that isn't what his public ministry was all about. But I would argue that this is a question that matters not just to Christians, but to anyone who's interested in the history of our form of civilization. And the reason is this. If Jesus had not been declared to be God, his disciples would have remained a small sect within Judaism. They would not have attracted large numbers of Gentile converts. If they hadn't attracted large numbers of Gentile converts, the religion would not have grown at a substantial rate until the beginning of the 4th century, when it made up something like 5% of the Roman Empire. So there were maybe 3 million Christians by the year 300. If Christianity had not been a sizable minority at the beginning of the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine almost certainly would not have converted to Christianity. And if that had not happened, then the Roman state would not have become Christian. And if the Roman state had not become Christian, we wouldn't have had the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Reformation, or modernity as we know it. So it's a rather important question because all of this hinges on this claim that Jesus became God.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like the butterfly effect, all these little things, little changes.
Yeah, changes everything.
It is interesting to think about what the world would look like today if Christianity did not take off the way it did.
Right. Well, and there's no knowing. It might be far better. It might be far worse. But in either event, it'd be far different.
Yes. Yeah. So you mentioned briefly that in what you just said, that Jesus did not understand himself to be God, nor did he describe himself as such. Now, any decent Christian, I would guess, could probably rattle off half dozen verses that would seem to contradict this conclusion. How do you respond to those?
Yeah, well, this is another part of my book that conservative evangelicals will not be comfortable with. So the idea that Jesus was going around during his public ministry calling himself God is found principally in the Gospel of John, our last gospel, the latest gospel. In this gospel, Jesus says things like, before Abraham was, I am. Well, anybody who knows their Bible realizes what he's saying. Abraham was the father of the Jews who lived 1,800 years before Jesus. And Jesus says he existed before Abraham. Not only that, but he says, I am. That's the name of God in the Old Testament. In the book of Exodus, when Moses asked God, what is your name? God says, I am. Jesus now is claiming to be I am. And his Jewish opponents know full well what he's saying. They take up stones to stone him to death. Later in the Gospel, chapter 10 of John, Jesus says, I and the Father are one. Later in the Gospel, he's talking to his disciples, and he says, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. And so Jesus makes these claims about himself as being, in some sense, equal with God. But these claims are found only in the Gospel of John. They're not found in our earlier Gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And they're not found in any of the sources available to Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So I argue in the book that this view that you find in the Gospel of John is distinctive of John, but it's not historically reliable. It's not what Jesus himself was actually saying. If he had said these things about himself, it is inconceivable that the earliest accounts of his sayings don't even mention this. I mean, this would be the most important thing that he could possibly teach. And so it's just beyond belief that they just thought, well, I'm not going to bring up that part. So almost certainly Jesus did not make these kinds of sayings during his public ministry.
Right. So the Gospel of John, it's less historically reliable, I would say. Would it be because it's, first of all, it's the most recent gospel, correct? And also, isn't that the gospel that has the whole story with all the zombies and everybody coming out of their grave? It just doesn't seem as realistic as, say, the other ones where Jesus is just doing magic tricks, turning water into wine.
Well, yeah, actually, yeah. So you got the two reversed.
I did.
So the zombie story actually is the Gospel of Matthew.
Oh, okay.
As it turns out. So, I mean, all of these Gospels contain legendary elements, and the question is, when we're reading a story, which parts of the story are legendary and which parts are historically accurate, if any part is historically accurate. Mm-hmm. And you're right, John is the last of the Gospels, and it simply contains more legendary materials. Again, this isn't sort of a crazy view of a wide-eyed liberal. This is simply standard biblical scholarship. This is what seminarians learn in seminary if they're going to a mainline traditional denominational school. That John is a more theologically loaded gospel, which may be more important for theology, but it's not as useful for historical purposes.
So from a theological perspective, one can argue that the Gospel of John and Jesus's claims of being God are spiritually accurate or theologically accurate, and it was guided by the Holy Spirit, and those are the truths that God wants us to know. But from your point of view, from an historian and from a scholar, you just cannot accept that on historical grounds.
Yeah, I don't accept that it's historically accurate, and I don't deal with the question of whether it's theologically useful, because I'm not a theologian. I'm a historian. I do know lots of Christian scholars who agree with me that it's not historically accurate, but they find it to be theologically important, and so I have no quarrel with that because I'm not a theologian.
Gotcha, and that makes perfect sense. Now, if I were to read the Bible from the perspective of an inerrantist, that is, view the Bible as infallible, would I be justified in my belief that, first of all, God or Jesus was God, and B, Jesus claimed to be God?
Yes, if you think the Bible has no errors in it, then Jesus clearly claims to be God in the Gospel of John. And so if John's message is basically the historical Jesus message, then you would certainly think that Jesus called himself God and that he was God.
But what about all of the other verses in the other books where it seems like he can't be God, with some of the things that he said and just some of the other verses like nobody knows when the kingdom of heaven will come besides the Father?
Well, so in none of the other Gospels did Jesus come out and say, I am not God. And so if you think that Jesus is God based on the Gospel of John, what you do is you read the other Gospels in light of that belief. So that if Jesus says no one knows the day or the hour when the end will come, what you do is you say, because Jesus was God who became a human, he accepted human limitations. And one of those limitations is the inability to know everything. And so because he has willingly limited himself, that's why he says he doesn't know when the end will come.
So when God was Jesus, who was taking care of all the work up in heaven? That's what I want to know.
Right. So this is a struggle this is a theological struggle that Christians had to deal with, especially in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. That if God is God and Jesus is God, don't you have two gods? And if you think that they're the same God, that Jesus actually is the same as God the Father, then you've got a problem because, there's nobody taking care of the world while Jesus is down here. But Christians insisted that Jesus was God and that God was God and that they were different from each other. They're not the same thing. They're not identical. They're equal. The trick was how they could argue that Jesus was equal with God the Father, so that they were both God, and yet there's only one God. That's the theological trick, and that's what eventually leads them to the doctrine of the Trinity.
Right, and they had basically 2,000 years to massage that story, so it's so it works well. We'll talk about the Trinity in a bit. I want to ask you first, why do you think Jesus was actually crucified?
Well, I don't think there's much doubt about this historically. The accounts line up perfectly well, and they make perfect sense with what we know historically about what's going on in the Roman Empire. When Jesus is put on trial before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, he's not asked whether he's committed blasphemy. He's not asked whether he has called himself God. Those are not the charges. Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And when Jesus gets crucified, there's a placard put over his head which says, "This is the King of the Jews." So he was executed for calling himself the King of the Jews. That's a political charge. Romans simply didn't care at all about whether somebody committed a Jewish blasphemy or not, but they did care about political claims. And so Jesus was executed on grounds of insurgency, that he, in fact, was claiming to be king when only the Romans could appoint the Jewish king.
Okay. Now, another somewhat shocking conclusion in your book is that Jesus' earthly followers did not believe him to be God. Why is this?
Yeah, well, this may be shocking to the newcomer to biblical studies, but it won't be shocking to biblical scholars. And I think, except for very conservative evangelicals, I think most biblical scholars would absolutely agree with this. And it's because if Jesus was not calling himself God during his public ministry, there'd be no reason for his disciples to think he was God. And in fact, there's nothing in the stories to suggest they had any inkling that he was God. They didn't even, in our earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, they didn't even understand what it meant for him to be the Messiah. The Messiah in ancient Jewish thinking was not God, was not a divine being. But Jesus in the Gospel of Mark is the Messiah. But the whole point of one of the whole points of the Gospel of Mark is that nobody can figure out what he means by that. What Jesus means by that in Mark is that he has to die for the sins of others. But no Jew thought that was what the Messiah was supposed to be. The Messiah was supposed to be the future king. And so they misunderstand. So if they can't even understand that he's a Messiah, there's nothing to suggest anybody thought that he was God.
So I'm just trying to relate that to the earlier one, that Jesus thought himself to be God. If he thought himself to be God, wouldn't it reason that his followers would understand him to be God?
Yeah, you're not talking about my view. You're talking about the conservative evangelical views?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, conservative evangelicals would say Jesus called himself God and his disciples figured that part out, yes. Oh, okay. But what I'm saying is that biblical scholars who are not fundamentalists don't have that view. That's a fundamentalist view, but it's not the view the biblical scholars tend to have.
Okay. I think that makes some sense now. And I guess a less shocking conclusion that you come to is the doctrine of the Trinity was a much later development in Christianity. Maybe it's just me being too secular, but isn't that a given among all scholars, that the Trinity didn't develop, including Christian scholars, that it didn't develop until much later on?
Yeah, what conservative evangelicals would say is that the idea of the Trinity was already present in shadowy form. They wouldn't use the term shadowy, but that it was there in nucleus during the time of Jesus, and that what happened is progressively people figured it out. What scholars would say is that what I would say is not that it was already there in nucleus and that they worked it out. It's that they actually had to devise the doctrine of the Trinity to make sense of their various claims. Mm-hmm. So that they're claiming that Jesus is God, and they're claiming that God is God, and they also think that there's a Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is God. But they want to insist that these three are different beings. They're not all the same being. There are three distinct beings, Father, Son, and Spirit. All three are equally God, and yet they want to insist that they're monotheists. There's only one God. And so how can you have only one God if you've got three beings who are God? The doctrine of the Trinity is the solution to that. In the doctrine of the Trinity, there's only one God, but he's manifest in three persons who are distinct from each other, Father, Son, and Spirit, and all three are equally God.
So this came about when, historically, like timeline?
So what happens is in the late 2nd century, so let's say 150, 170 years after Jesus' death, there were Christians who were trying to figure out how it could work, that you've got God is God, Jesus is God, and the Spirit is God. And there was a group of people who thought that the way it worked was there's only one God who has three modes of existence. So that I myself, for example, am at the same time I'm a son and a brother and a father. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, God is like that. He's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit all at the same time. But there's only one of him. Well, this view ended up being declared a heresy because it didn't preserve the distinctiveness of the three very well. And it had to come up with these kind of ridiculous claims that, like, when Jesus was praying, he was talking to himself. And so that didn't make sense. So they ended up saying, no, there have to be three, but these three are one. And so the doctrine of the Trinity then that emerged is that there's one God manifest in three persons. The first person to use this term Trinity was a man named Tertullian around the year 200. He was a theologian who lived in northern Africa, very important author from early Christianity. He used the term Trinity to refer to the fact that you've got the one God who's manifest in three persons.
All right. Well, yes, someday hopefully I'll get even a little bit inkling of an understanding of what the Trinity is, but no matter how many times it was explained, maybe it's just the reason in my mind, but I just can't make any sense of it whatsoever.
Oh, no, actually, you're on the right track if you can't understand it.
Okay, good.
The whole deal is that the best theologians declare it a mystery, which means that you can't understand it rationally, and if you think you understand it, you misunderstand it.
Gotcha. Kind of like quantum physics, I guess.
Yes, right, exactly.
You just gotta put a little faith into it, right?
Yes,
that's
right.
the way. All right, I want to talk about this book that was a response to your book. I thought this was very interesting for a few reasons. Well, the response of the book is titled "How God Became Jesus: The Real Origins of Belief in Jesus' Divine Nature." And I thought why this was so interesting was because you actually gave these people a copy of your manuscript before it was published and said, here you go ahead and write your response. Is that true?
That's true. Yeah, we thought that would be tremendously interesting.
It was.
To have a response to my book written before I even published my book.
That's right. And from what I understand, both books came out on the same day. They were released on the same day.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So does that title piss you off a little bit? The Real Origins of Belief.
No, what pissed me off was that when they sent their book to journals and magazines to review, they sent with it a little packet of hand sanitizer and with a note that said, wash yourself from bad history.
Yeah.
That wasn't good.
You're listening to the Humanist Hour. I'm Bo Bennett. And we're speaking with Dr. Bart Ehrman on his new book, How Jesus Became God, The Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. And I take it they weren't referring to their own book.
No, they were referring to mine.
Gotcha. Oh, boy. I honestly, I didn't read their response book. I just read some reviews of the response book and so forth. And I read your review of your response to the response, basically saying that you didn't feel a need to give a response chapter by chapter. And what else? What is your summary of their response?
Well, so there were five evangelical scholars who were responding to different parts of my book. Some of these are very fine scholars. The problem with the response book, I think, is what they try to do is they try to take pot shots at this, that, or the other thing that I say. Mm-hmm. And so one chapter will be attacking one thing I say, another chapter will be attacking something else I say, and it ends up being very piecemeal. And what you never get from their book is an alternative explanation. And I don't know if it's because there's five people trying to work together or if they just didn't have enough time or what. But you would think with a book called How God Became Jesus and a book that is trying to show how it really happened, that there'd be some kind of narrative about how it really happened. And they don't give a narrative about how it really happened. All they do is they try and take apart my book. So there's almost nothing to compare. You just have to see what they say and compare it with what I say and decide who's right. But it would be nice if they think I'm wrong about how Jesus became God, then I'd like them to explain how Jesus became God or how it happened. And I think one reason they don't is because they're not able to do it historically. They can only do it theologically. Well, that's fine if they have a theological view that God became Jesus. But if they don't have a historical view, then it's really not an attack on my book, and they ought to fess up about that.
You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of those people at business meetings who just shoot down all the ideas. That's a terrible idea. That's a stupid idea. You say, okay, well, do you have a better idea? No.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it happens in academic circles too, in departmental meetings.
Right.
Same dynamic, and that's exactly what's going on with this book. They're willing to try and disagree with me on this point or that point, but they don't put together an alternative hypothesis.
Right. Yeah, that's just annoying and wrong. Here is a clip from the promotional video on how God became Jesus. Again, not to be confused with your book, How Jesus Became God. And this is an interesting clip because I want people to listen to what the author is saying, and we'll talk about this right after. It's only about 50 seconds or so. So here we go.
But what difference does it make? Does it really matter if Jesus is fully divine, semi-divine, mostly divine, or not divine at all? Fried chicken will still taste good. Seahawks will have still won the NFL. Maybe Jesus can just be a good religious teacher and it'd be admired and venerated for his teaching. But the fact is, it does make a huge difference. For example, when we look at the cross, what exactly are we seeing? Are we seeing a man who is in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing the wrong thing, being punished unjustly? Or, when we look at the cross, do we see God crucified? Is this the point where God was reconciling the world to himself by setting forth his Son to be a sacrifice for our sins? That is a completely different story, and it makes a world of difference.
So there you go. Now,
I'd never heard that.
Oh, you never heard that?
No, I don't watch their promotions.
Okay. Well, this is on YouTube. You could Google it.
Well, the music's a killer.
Oh yeah. Oh, you should see the visual effects too. Very well done.
Oh yeah.
Extremely well done. Professional quality. But the first thing that came to my mind is totally the fallacy of appealing to the consequences. And I find that this would be extremely common with Christian scholars. What they're actually doing is they're starting with the conclusion and then working backwards from there, finding the evidence to support the conclusions in some way, or even twisting the evidence if need be. Do you find that happens a lot?
Well, it does. Not with the kinds of scholars I run around with, but with conservative evangelical scholars, absolutely. And it's conservative evangelical Christians who listen to that, of course, think that Christ was God who died for their sins, and so that's very appealing to them, that kind of statement. But the question of whether it's theologically important or not has no bearing on the historical questions.
Right.
So, and let me just say that he is unfairly categorizing my book, even in that short clip, in a way that would not occur to people. In my book, in fact, I do not take a stand on whether or not Jesus is God. I'm not a theologian. That's a theological question, a religious question. And I don't say Jesus is not God because that's a theological statement. I'm not interested in that theological statement. And so to pretend that I'm trying to argue that Jesus is not God is completely wrong, and it confuses the categories of history and theology that I'm trying to keep straight, and they're just not listening to that. I should also point out that I had 4 friends of mine read the book to make comments on it, the way I do with all my books. I always have scholars read the book ahead of time before I send it to the publisher. These 4 scholars who read my book are all Christians, and one of them, one of my closest friends, I know if you ask him, was Jesus God? Or is Jesus God? He would say, yes. And he didn't disagree with anything in the book because he's a scholar and he knows the difference between doing history and doing theology. And these respondents don't seem to know the difference.
Gotcha. That's interesting. And I'm glad that you keep that line because, as you pointed out, many people don't, and that becomes a problem. So what so far do you think has been the best critique for your book? And why?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm kind of waiting for the best critique. I mean, I haven't read much. I obviously read the response book. The most intellectually engaged response in the response book was by Craig Evans on the question of whether Jesus was given a decent burial. He actually marshaled a very strong argument that I was wrong. And I think it's the one chapter I'm going to respond to because I think he's completely wrong. And I think I can show it. But if you didn't know how to respond to him, it would seem pretty convincing. Simon Gathercole gave a nice response in his part of the response book. He's a professor at Cambridge University in England. I had a 2-hour debate with him on the radio in England. And so I completely disagreed with his point of view as well. So, people can come up with good responses, and there can be differences of opinion on really basic historical facts. And so I think both Simon Gathercole and Craig Evans and I can have that conversation because they're willing to engage with these issues historically. And so I think that's really what I prefer rather than these other kinds of theological responses.
Gotcha. So the other side of that coin, what are some of the stupidest critiques of your book and why?
Well, yeah, there are a lot of them. I actually don't read too many of the stupid critiques because I just, it makes my blood boil and I've got better things to do with my life. I will say that there was a response book that was published as an ebook even before my book appeared by someone who had not read my book.
Oh, geez.
The ebook is called, you can get it apparently. I didn't get it, but the ebook is called, so my book is How Jesus Became God. And his book is called, this ebook is called How Jesus Became God in the Flesh. So I would say that must be a fairly silly response by somebody who hadn't even bothered to read my book yet.
Yeah, I bet you get a lot of those. So that's good that you don't spend a lot of your days reading YouTube comments.
I've got so much to do. There's no way I'm going to spend my time doing that.
Not a good way to spend time.
No.
Dr. Ehrman, I'd like to end by talking about your blog. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Right. So 2 years ago, I started a blog, the Bart Ehrman blog. I actually call it Christianity in Antiquity, the CIA. Mm-hmm. And it's a blog that I post on 5 or 6 times a week, usually about 1,000-word posts each day. And it deals with all issues involving the history of the New Testament, the historical Jesus, early Christianity, anything related to any of that. I deal with what readers of the blog want me to deal with. I deal with things that I'm interested in. So it's a wide range of things, and people get a lot out of this blog. The thing about the blog is that it's a membership blog, which means people have to pay to join. It's $24.95 for a year, so about $2 a month. But, you get a lot for that $2 a month, and I give every single penny to charity. The proceeds from the blog all go to charities dealing with hunger and homelessness. And so that's the reason I charge for the blog, and it's actually the reason I do the blog, because if I weren't raising money for charity, I actually wouldn't do it because, as I said, I've got a lot of things to be doing, and the blog takes me about an hour a day that I could be doing something else with.
Yeah. And how much money have you raised so far?
So in the first 2 years, I raised just over $100,000.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's great. And I'd love to raise more. I keep setting my goals higher and higher, and I'd like more and more people to join, and people get a lot out of it. And so I hope people will continue to join.
Well, I think it's a very interesting model. I don't know if you came up with the idea, if you modeled it after somebody else, but people like to donate. They like to make a difference. They like to put their money somewhere good. And if they could also get something in return, everybody wins. You're the one that's actually doing all the work for this, having to blog an hour a day. But I take it you enjoy doing that, so it is a case where everybody wins.
Yeah, I think everybody wins. And, to some people, it seems weird to have to pay for a blog. But, since it all goes to charity, it's just like it's taxed. You get what do you call it? Not tax free. What do you call it? Well,
tax deductible.
Thank you. Tax deductible. It's all tax deductible. So, yeah. And people, of course, can donate to the blog as well and that sort of thing. So.
Right. And where could they find the blog? What's the URL?
Oh, God, I don't know. Just Google Bart Ehrman blog and you'll find it.
Yeah, there you go. That's the best way to do it. I get annoyed when people give these long URLs with all these slashes and the dots and the...
Exactly.
Just forget. Just Google it. Google the thing.
Yeah,
you can find it that way.
Right.
It's easy to find. So, Dr. Ehrman, what's your next project? Anything exciting you're working on you want to share?
Well, so I'm debating what the next thing's going to be. I've got two options. One option is a book on how it is Christians ended up with the Old Testament. And so it's the kind of thing like, and so Christians took over the Jewish Bible and claimed that it was their Bible. Mm-hmm. And so I'm interested in how this led to conflicts with Jews who were not happy about the fact that somebody else was stealing their Bible. So that's one possibility. That I would call Jesus and the Battle for Scripture, but to my own mind, I'm calling it How Christians Stole the Bible. So we'll see if that happens. The other thing I've gotten really interested in is what was happening when Christians were telling and retelling their stories of Jesus before anybody wrote them down. And I've started reading extensively in the question of how people remember things and how people distort memories and misremember things. And I'm interested in how oral societies work and how traditions fare in oral versus written cultures. So that would be, I'm debating which of those two things to pursue at this point.
They're both very interesting. From a psychological perspective, I like the second one better, so that's my vote.
Well, that's where I'm leaning right now. It's what I'm doing all my reading on, but I'll probably write both books eventually. It's only a question of which one.
Which is first. Next. Sure. All right. Well, this has been very enlightening, very entertaining. I want to thank you so much for taking your time. And once again, the book is called How Jesus Became God, The Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. Dr. Ehrman, thank you so much, and hope to see you again soon.
Great. Thanks a lot.
All right. You take care. That was Dr. Bart Ehrman talking about his book, How Jesus Became God, The Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. Well, talking to people like Dr. Ehrman constantly reminds me how much I don't know, how ignorant I actually am. A few years ago, I spent, I think it was 8 months reading the entire Bible. I spent several hours a day reading the thing from cover to cover. And I know this is not that common, especially, well, I would think it's actually more common among atheists or non-believers who are just interested in finding out what this whole Bible thing is about. I remember when I was growing up as a Catholic, we were not encouraged to read the Bible. In fact, if we had any questions about the Bible, we were to ask the priest or ask the nun in Sunday school, and they were going to give us the answers. But we were not encouraged to read the Bible. And after I read the Bible, I found out why. There is a lot of nasty stuff in there. I mean, really, really scary, nasty, sadomasochist stuff. And, whew, boy, it's a scary book. Not something you want to read to kids before bed. I guess that's why they kind of pick and choose the nice little pretty warm and fuzzy passages to read before bed to kids, or to read in Sunday school, or to read at weddings. But if you had like a random Bible verse generator, and you would have to read one of those verses like in church or a public event, it would not be good. It would not be good, folks. But Dr. Bart Ehrman is a very, very good scholar, and he has a lot of courses at the Great Courses. You can Google the Great Courses, and if you want to know more about Christianity, he speaks about all different areas of Christianity, and I certainly suggest checking that out. They're very interesting. So we talked about the book, and if you're interested in the book and you want it, but you don't really want to pay for it, here's a solution. Just go to audibletrial.com/humanist, sign up for a free 30-day trial, and you could download Dr. Ehrman's audiobook for free. And the best thing about it, it's an audiobook. You don't have to read it. You just get to listen to it. And I love to listen to books when I'm exercising and going for walks, going for bike rides, whatever. They're very enjoyable. If you already happen to own this book, you could still download any other book for free, any one of Dr. Ehrman's books, or any book that is available at audible.com. Not only are you getting a free book, but when you open a trial account at audibletrial.com/humanist, you are supporting the American Humanist Association and this podcast. So please go to audibletrial.com/humanist and download your free book today.